All right, today we're going to dig into a really fascinating, kind of lost chapter of American history. It's about a radical law that tried to outlaw segregation almost 100 years before the civil rights movement we all know. It was a promise of equality that almost changed everything. So let's just start with a huge what if. I mean, really think about this. What if the entire Jim Crow era, all those decades of forced, brutal racial segregation, had been stopped dead in its tracks before it even began? It sounds like something out of an alternate history novel. But as we're about to see, it almost happened. Okay, so our story kicks off right after the Civil War, during this incredibly chaotic but also hopeful time called Reconstruction. America was scrambling to figure out what freedom really meant for millions of newly freed Black citizens, and Congress decided to make a statement that was, for the time, truly radical. And this was it, the Civil Rights Act of 1875. Its goal was simple, but absolutely revolutionary: to guarantee that every single citizen, no matter their race, could use the same hotels, ride the same streetcars, and sit in the same theaters. I mean, this was a full-on attempt to integrate American society, decades and decades before the struggles of the 20th century. You have to understand, this was the grand finale. It was the last big, ambitious legislative push of the entire Reconstruction era, a really bold attempt to define what freedom and equality were actually supposed to look like after slavery. It was a real high watermark for civil rights, but the tide was about to go out fast. But of course, a promise this huge, this radical, yeah, it was never going to be easy. Getting this bill passed was a long, brutal fight, and in the end, it only became law because of a pretty tragic twist of fate. So just look at this timeline for a second. We're talking 5 years this thing dragged on in Congress. Its biggest champion, Senator Charles Sumner, fought for it like a lion. But get this, it only managed to pass after he died. It became sort of a memorial to the man himself. That alone tells you just how incredibly controversial this law really was. So the law was passed. It was official. It's on the books. But a law is really just words on paper if no one is willing to enforce it. And this is where the grand promise of the 1875 Act really began to crumble. And this is where things get really weird, because you see this huge contradiction. On the one hand, President Ulysses S. Grant had been absolutely ruthless in using federal troops to crush the Ku Klux Klan. But on the other hand, when it came to this brand new Civil Rights Act, his administration just went silent. Grant never publicly supported it, and his Justice Department basically just pretended it didn't exist. So you see the problem, right? This law was basically an orphan from the moment it was signed. The president didn't want it, federal judges were already hostile to it, and public opinion was largely against it. With no powerful friends in its corner, the act was effectively dead on arrival. So the act was powerless, but it wasn't officially dead just yet. Nope. The final nail in the coffin would be hammered in 8 years later, not by politicians, but by the Supreme Court itself. And boom, in 1883, in this landmark ruling known as the Civil Rights Cases, the Supreme Court didn't just weaken the law, it absolutely destroyed it. And look at that vote, an 8-1 decision. That's a near-unanimous death sentence. Okay, so let's break down their reasoning, because this is the crucial point. They argued that the 14th Amendment, the one that guarantees equal protection, only applied to governments. It stopped a state like Virginia from passing a segregation law. But, and this is the giant but, they said it did nothing to stop a private business owner in Virginia from refusing service to Black customers. And with that one decision, the Supreme Court basically gave a giant green light to private segregation nationwide. Only one person, one justice, John Marshall Harlan, stood against the majority. He wrote this incredibly powerful dissent, and he correctly predicted that the court's decision would kickstart a whole new era of discrimination. And you know what? He was absolutely right. That's exactly what happened with the rise of Jim Crow. And for almost a century, that's where the story seemed to end, in failure. But the core idea of the 1875 Act, it never really died. It just went dormant, waiting for its moment to reemerge. It would take another 81 years. Just let that sink in for a second. Almost a full century would pass before Congress would successfully pass another law guaranteeing access to public accommodations. And this, right here, this is the brilliant legal workaround. When the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964 was finally passed,
It did the exact same thing as the 1875 law, but the lawyers behind it had learned from history. Instead of using the 14th Amendment, which the Supreme Court had already shot down, they used a completely different part of the Constitution, the Commerce Clause. The argument was pure genius. A hotel or a restaurant serves travelers from other states, right? Well, that's interstate commerce, and Congress can regulate that. It was like using a different legal key to unlock the exact same door.
So yeah, while the historian John Hope Franklin correctly said that the 1875 Act was a failure in its own time, its spirit and its goals, they absolutely were not. It actually served as the blueprint for a future victory, which really just leaves us with this final question, right? Does a law truly fail if its ideas end up inspiring justice for a future generation? The story of the Civil Rights Act of 1875 is such a powerful reminder that progress isn't always a straight line. Sometimes a failure in the present is just planting the seeds for a victory that's still generations in the making.